Very much. Let's bring in the panel, bat this around a little bit for more on this story today. David Drucker is a staff writer for Roll Call. Pete Seat is the former Deputy Assistant Press Secretary for George W. Bush. And Kirsten Powers is a columnist for the New York Post and a Fox News contributor. You know, in some ways, it might seem Pete, why don't you start with this? Kind of silly to point the finger at Fox as the president did in that interview. He said, you know, oh, well, I guess you're talking about Fox. He said there's one network that seems to be directed almost solely against me. But when you look at the numbers, and I think we have a graph that we can pull up here, positive and negative stories, Obama-McCain, this is from the campaign period, it's pretty interesting because they're pretty even at Fox and pretty uneven according to this, you know, independent poll for MSNBC. What do you think about all that, Pete?
Well, it's interesting because President Obama told Brian Williams in a special that was on NBC a few weeks ago that he doesn't watch the cable chatter. So how does he even know that there's more supposedly negative coverage on Fox News if he's not even watching it? Obviously, his staff is filling him in and telling him what's going on. But another poll that I think is interesting that Pew put out is that over half of respondents, I think it was 53%, think that there is too much personal coverage of President Obama instead of focusing on his policies. And, you know, when we get these clips of the president going out to get a hamburger or walking Bo the dog, or yesterday the CNBC interview on NBC Nightly News, instead of showing substance from the interview, they showed President Obama killing a fly. And that's what we're being shown on mainstream networks, which is why people are turning away from it.
Let's take a look. Do we want to take a look at that Harvard shot? Go ahead, let's roll it.
You said, I observed that you hadn't gotten much bad press. You said, it's coming. Media critics would say, not only has it not come, but that you've gotten such favorable press, either because of bias or because you're good box office, that it's hurting the country because you're not being sufficiently held accountable for your policies. Assess that.
All right, and then he went on to assess that, and that is what we showed you before. Kirsten, talk to me about, you know, this is a president who talks a lot about reaching across both sides of the aisle. You know, why wouldn't he want to be challenged by somebody who's going to ask him tough questions?
I don't think he's probably afraid of people asking him tough questions. I tend to think with the media that they don't understand a lot of these issues. I mean, the reality is most of them don't know how to ask the tough questions about the economy. Did any of them warn us that the economy was about to collapse? No, for the most part. You know, people weren't asking tough questions even when George Bush was president. So one criticism I have of these studies is that it assumes that they're all equally competent. It assumes that Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama all are equally competent and should get equal amounts of positive press, when we know that that's not true. Bill Clinton's early days when in the presidency were a disaster, so he should have been getting bad press. I think you can make an argument that while I do think the media needs to be not so focused on this fluffy stuff, that Obama has had a pretty successful job in terms of communicating with people, and he communicates and explains things to people so much more so than past presidents have, that I think that it accounts a lot for how people feel about him. That even if they're not sure, they're like...
He even said in his book, Audacity of Hope, David Drucker, he said, people like, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, people like to like me. And I think that's a huge part of this. I think there's a lot of press out there that liking President Obama. He's a, you know, a likable guy, but as John Harwood points out, is there a danger inherent in that?
Well, yeah, because eventually the press is going to turn on you. We're still very young into President Obama's term, and even though his honeymoon's going to last a little bit longer than most presidents, it will eventually end. And the other thing I'd point out that I really believe this president is the first celebrity president we've had of the modern media age. JFK and his wife were to a degree royalty, but President Obama and his wife are on Us Magazine, and they are all over the place for things they do that have nothing to do with policy, and that is because they are very popular right now, and they are very engaging and attractive people. But eventually, the press will turn on them, and I do think the point that was made about the press not being expert at a lot of these issues is one of the reasons why the president isn't getting the tough questions. Look, most of my colleagues are not economists. They are not healthcare experts. So when the president has something to say about health care, as he will in that ABC special coming up, how many of my colleagues know enough to ask the right kind of questions to hold his feet to the fire? And that includes myself on certain issues. We are simply reporters, and that's what allows the president off the hook.
Reporters are people too, and they do sense what these things mean, and they do have good questions. And I do think that he has been held to the fire a little bit more. We've seen it happening in Robert Gibbs' press conferences lately. The questions are getting a little bit tougher, a little bit more focused. But one of the things that bothers me the most, and I want to ask you guys about this. What do you think? And have you seen presidents in the past, Pete, start with you, calling out one network or one media operation for scrutiny? Have you seen that before? And do you think that's okay?
No, and as I recall, in the last primetime press conference that President Obama did, Major Garrett was not called on. And, I think it's not really the right tack to take, and President Bush, obviously, I recall this from being there, was very fair in calling on all the TV networks, on all the wires. He would try to get to a lot of the radio networks as well to make sure they all had a chance. And let me just real quick, I want to touch on what you said, Martha, is I do agree that the questions for Gibbs have been getting tougher. I think the White House correspondents have been getting tougher. Where they haven't been getting tougher is on the major network appearances, such as the Brian Williams special and other things. So I definitely want to stick up for my press friends a little bit on that.
All right, PC, Kirsten Powers, David Drucker, lots more to talk about this. It's an interesting issue, and we're going to keep pressing it. He said he wants tough questions. He loves lively debate. Bring it on. Bring it on. Thanks very much, you guys. Trace, down to you.